Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian. I'm here today at the Rock Island Auction Company looking at some of the rifles they're going to be selling in their upcoming December of 2016 premiere auction. We have a really cool one here to look at today. This is another of the early semi-automatic rifles, and this is a Chinese General Liu rifle. Now, this never actually had a formal designation in China. When it was tested, it was simply referred to as the self-loading rifle. But it has come to be known by the name of its inventor, General T.E. Liu. General Liu was Chinese, of course, and born in 1869, an engineer, an administrator, all around apparently a pretty talented guy. So in 1912, Liu was appointed superintendent of the Hanyang Arsenal by none other than, at the time, Chinese President Sun Yat-sen. Hanyang was one of the main government arms-producing arsenals in China at the time, and it was a pretty important position, pretty prestigious position to be in. Well, Hanyang also was in need of new machinery and new tooling. It needed modernization. And at the same time, General Liu had designed a semi-automatic combat rifle of his own development. And here's this perfect mix of he's got the idea, and now he's in charge of an arsenal. And what Liu does is he's built a couple prototypes in China, and he decides to contact the Pratt Whitney company here in the United States about getting new manufacturing tooling, new machinery for the Hanyang Arsenal. And hey, since we're getting new tooling, let's get exactly what we're going to need to build my new semi-automatic rifle. He writes to Pratt Whitney in 1914, so reasonably quickly after taking his post at Hanyang. And Pratt & Whitney is amenable to this idea. They think it's pretty cool. So later in 1914, General Liu and his family, in fact, arrive in Hartford, Connecticut, where Pratt & Whitney is located. Now, Pratt & Whitney today, we would think of as probably an aircraft manufacturing company or an aircraft engine company. However, prior to World War II, they were also a munitions and arms making company. They did, in fact, they're notable for making some of the early pre-Gatling guns, or pre-machine guns. Gardner guns were manufactured by Pratt & Whitney, as well as other things, other firearms. So they were a good option. They knew how to make guns, they knew how to make tooling. Cool, perfect. Liu shows up, they start putting this all together. By 1916, the manufacturing line is functional, and Pratt & Whitney starts making a handful of test guns. A few of those are sent back to China for testing, and they're actually tested alongside some of Liu's handmade prototypes. And there is actually still a Chinese testing report that has survived on these guns. In fact, I have a copy of it both in Chinese and translated into English on the website. If you're interested, you can see that. There's a link to that in the description text below. And it's interesting, the guns had some problems. Now, some of these problems were related to poor quality ammunition. Liu's prototype rifle that he made in China had apparently a poorly made recoil spring that wasn't up to the standards of the American-made guns. The American guns seem to have worked reasonably well. There were some concerns about long-term durability and longevity, but it seems to have been a decent design. So the idea was Pratt & Whitney would then ship all the tooling back to China, and they had a small batch of guns that they had manufactured just to prove out everything, make sure it was all working. By the way, that is the reason why the receiver markings on these rifles all say made by the Hanyang Arsenal, despite the fact that these guns were actually made by Pratt & Whitney, because they were sending back the tooling to make these receiver markings as well. So you're not going to produce the Hanyang tooling and have it say Pratt & Whitney on it. Anyway, the plan was this all goes back to China. China adopts a self-loading rifle, at the forefront of modern military technology, and everyone lives happily ever after. Unfortunately, things didn't really work out that way. What happened instead was the tooling shipment got delayed because of World War I, and it didn't ultimately wind up in China until 1919. Shortly before the tooling arrived, it's a little hazy exactly what happened here, but it appears that General Liu himself suffered a stroke and had to retire from his position. How debilitating of a stroke, I don't know. Some reports say he actually just died at that point. It seems to me more likely that he actually lived until 1929. But regardless, he was unable to continue his work at the Hanyang Arsenal or working with these self-loading rifles. As a result, he wasn't able to pick up, basically he wasn't able to arrange installation or transportation of this tooling that had been purchased. So the tooling ended up sitting on the docks in China for like 2 years before it was finally brought in. It was actually then sent to the Hanyang Arsenal. I'm probably mispronouncing that, but that's about as close as we're going to get. And this tooling was refitted and used to make bolt-action Mauser rifles. So the Liu rifle it had great potential, and it got to that point, and a couple things went wrong, and the project just completely fell apart. Without Liu there to actually basically hold its hand through setting up the machinery and getting the rifles into production and getting them formally adopted by the military, it just all fell apart. So the tooling did end up going into some use. It's kind of funny, a lot of that tooling apparently did finally come back to Hanyang, but not until 1935, when it was then set up to make Chiang Kai-shek pattern Mauser rifles. So that is kind of the lost story of the Chinese military semi-auto rifle. Wouldn't have been the first military semi-auto rifle. The Mondragon really does take that in 1908. But you know what? This is really right on the first wave of truly functional military self-loading rifles. So why don't we go ahead and take a look at the mechanics, because it's also mechanically a fascinatingly cool gun. It's a gas trap system initially kind of based on the Danish Bang system, and Bang rifles are quite hard to come by, but this is a very cool variant thereof, and so we can get an idea about how the Bang worked as well by looking at this guy. All right, let's start with a quick look at the markings here. Now, I don't know the exact translation of these, although I suspect by the time you watch this, someone in the comments will probably have explained them to us. But the gist of this is saying that the rifle is manufactured at the Hanyang Arsenal. Again, this rifle was actually manufactured by Pratt Whitney, but because this was a sample using tooling that was going to Hanyang, the receiver markings are set up to say Hanyang, because that's where this, in theory, would have been manufactured later on. Now, the rear sight markings are in Arabic numerals, which is not uncommon for this sort of thing. And you can see it's a pretty typical Mauser style rear sight. It goes out to 2,000 meters. We've got the same markings on the side there as on this side. This is chambered for 8mm Mauser, and interestingly, it actually holds 6 rounds in the gun, in the magazine. It does have a flush blind magazine, again like a Mauser. The only other markings on here, other than a couple of sporadic serial numbers that we'll see here and there, are these 2 markings on the muzzle cap. And this one, again, I don't know the exact translation, but this one is for semi-automatic mode, and then I can push this button and rotate the muzzle cap into its other position. This is manual mode, where it functions like a straight pull bolt-action rifle. So the basic idea of a gas trap or Bang style rifle is that the barrel actually ends about here. In fact, I can take this cap off, and you can see when we line it up, the muzzle ends there, this cap goes farther, and this cap is hollow inside. What this does is you get some of the blast. The bullet, of course, goes out this hole in the middle, but some of the gases and blast get trapped in this cap, and they serve to push the cap forward. That, in turn, pulls this forward. This is a spring-loaded connecting rod, and we'll see it in much more detail when we take the rifle apart. But basically what happens is when I pull that connecting rod forward, it pivots a lever and pushes the bolt backward. So this is the lever in its full forward position. You can see the bolt only traveled a short distance, maybe half an inch. That's closed. That's full travel. It's actually more like 3/4 of an inch probably. But that's the limit of the travel where the bolt is actually being directly propelled. After that, it's just moving on inertia. And once that inertia is going, the bolt is going to come all the way back to here. That is why the receiver has this weird extension, is so that you've got a place for the bolt to actually go. Now, the bolt has locked open because the magazine is empty. There is no manual hold open. This is just the follower. So when I push the follower down, the bolt will then travel closed, snap shut, relock, and it's ready to fire again. So there aren't a whole lot of controls on the Liu. The one that we really have is the safety here. When you rotate this up, that engages the safety. That is going to lock the bolt in position, and it doesn't interfere with the trigger, but it does prevent the gun from actually firing. What this is doing is actually grabbing the striker mechanism part of the bolt and holding it in place. You'll see how that works when we pull the top cover off. At any rate, that's safe, that's fire. So I already have the muzzle cap off. The next thing I need to do to disassemble this rifle is take out this split pin, because that, there's the other end of it, that's what's holding the front sight and the front band in place, and I need to take the stock off in order to show you the internals. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and we'll be back in a moment. Okay, with this split pin out now, I can slide this cap off the gun. That's going to have the front sight, which is why you want this pin to be nice and tight, and you can see it's locking into a piece that's fixed to the barrel here because you don't want your front sight wobbling around. But pull that off. This also, by the way, has our bayonet lug on it. Then we have the rear barrel band, which is just held in place by a typical spring-loaded catch. Although it's kind of unusual, I have to say this is actually the first time I've seen something quite like this. The band is not on the bottom or right at the side. It's located kind of at an odd angle, off-center on the bottom side of the rifle. Cool. Now we can lift off the front handguard. That shows us nothing at all up here because all the working bits are on the bottom. Next up, we're going to take out the floor plate and then take off the trigger guard. The floor plate is just a little spring-loaded catch. We push that down, pull it backward, just like a Mauser, and we get our magazine spring, follower, and floor plate. Then we have 3 screws here that hold the trigger guard in place. So we'll go ahead and pull those screws out. There we go. Production engineers will appreciate the fact that all 3 of these screws are the exact same specification. So you only have one pattern of screw that you need to produce, and you don't have to worry about getting them mixed up. Once those are out, then we can lift the floor plate and magazine box off, or the trigger guard and magazine box. Now, with all that done, we can take the stock off. Just a note to anyone doing this in the future, you do have to have the operating connecting rod pushed all the way forward, or pulled forward, in order to remove the stock. All right, now with the stock off, we can really see the cool bits. This is our connecting rod. So it's all the way up here at the muzzle. I put the gas cap back on for the time being. And then this rod comes all the way back to here at the front of the receiver. When the gas trap system pulls that rod forward, it's going to pivot on this pin, just like that, which is going to throw the bolt back. That is how the connecting rod system works. Now, in order to see how this locking system actually works, we have to pull a rear cap off of the receiver. This is just in there to make sure that the bolt doesn't come off the back of the gun when it's not supposed to. Now, the recoil spring for the bolt is located in this tube in the side of the receiver. So in order to take the bolt and bolt carrier off, we have to take out the spring. Before we can take the spring, we have to take out the connecting rod because the spring comes out the front and the connecting rod's in the way. Removing that rod is pretty easy. We've got this pin. We're going to rotate it around to there. You'll notice when it's in place here, it's locked by this little tab. Now that it's there, I can just pull that pin out. And then the rod drops out of its position. I'll go ahead and take the muzzle cap back off. Now with the rod out, you can see the front of the mainspring guide rod right there. It's got that nice large flat surface because that's where the little finger on the connecting rod is going to push it. And that rod is also back here. It's got a keyway to it that locks it into this piece, which is the bolt carrier and receiver cover. So when the rod gets pushed backward, it's compressing the spring inside this tube, and it is pushing the bolt carrier back, which pushes the bolt back. Complicated enough? So the back of this spring guide rod does have a little screwdriver slot. It also has a little tiny pin, which I don't know if you can quite see. It's got a little spring-loaded pin that prevents it from rotating, because when you rotate at 90 degrees, it's going to unlock and the spring will go shooting out the front of this tube if you're not holding it in place. And so that spring detent is very important to prevent it from spontaneously disassembling itself. All right, what I am going to do here is use a screwdriver to, I can push down that detent, I can then rotate this, okay, and then that spring is going to come right out the front. Now this actually has two springs, and they are separate, not entirely sure why there, but there is our guide rod, which is also kind of part of our operating rod, and its two mainsprings. With the spring out, we can now just pull this off the back of the action. So the way this works, the rear part of the bolt is permanently situated in this round recess. The front part of the bolt can slide back and forth in here. That is how it locks and unlocks. You can see right there, that's the keyway for the spring guide. See the key there locks into this like so. It goes in further and then locks, but I don't need to do that right now. So that is what connects the bolt ultimately to the recoil spring, and from there out to the muzzle. If we look inside this, you can see that we have this piece rotating when I turn the safety. In the safe, this is the fire position where it doesn't obscure anything. This is the safe position where this piece is coming downward. What it is going to do is actually grab a hold of, let's see if I can get this. There we go. You can see that cutout in there. This piece on the inside is the actual striker. Ooh, wow, that's a strong spring. So when this rifle is cocked, the sear, firing mechanism sear, is holding this lip. That's holding the striker back. When you pull the trigger, the sear drops, which releases this. It snaps forward. However, the safety will lock it in place and hold it to the rear, thus safing the rifle, preventing it from dropping. Our locking lug is this guy. This is very similar to like an 1886 or 1888 Mannlicher locking system. That lug is going to pivot up and down. So this is the unlocked position. You'll notice we have an angled lug here that's going to travel in a couple of little rails in the locking lug, so that when this rear piece comes forward, which it has to do to fire because it's connected to the striker and the firing pin, when that happens, those two lugs force this locking block down. If the locking block can't go down, this piece can't go forward, and that is a safety mechanism that prevents the gun from firing unless it is actually fully locked. So the bottom surface right there is our locking lug. That is going to lock up into this locking shoulder. Like I said, this is similar to the early Mannlicher straight pull rifles. It's honestly not that great of a system. It probably works, but you know, it's kind of iffy. You have potentially a lot of stress on this round pin that could deform. You only have one. You got one locking lug. It's off center. This isn't nearly as strong as having the whole back of the bolt tilt, which is what this kind of evolved into, I would say. Now it does mean you don't need any extra stuff at the front. So there's no locking lug in the front. We have a nice big extractor here on the side. The firing pin is protruding forward because everything at the back here is in its compressed and fired position. The sear is right there, and when I pull the trigger, you can see that drops. Then of course it has a disconnect mechanism built into it so that it only fires once. When I pull this far enough down, the trigger is going to lose contact with that piece, which allows the sear to spring back up and blocks the bolt from firing a second time unless I pull the trigger a second time. This big flat spring is actually what's putting pressure on this guy, the sear itself. We have a trigger spring back here. You can see how the two kind of work together. We do have a stripper clip guide here. I mentioned this held 6 rounds in the magazine. It was fed by a proprietary Chinese stripper clip. This thing in the side is an ejection buffer, or a case deflector, I suppose is a better term for it, to ensure that the cases go out in the appropriate direction. And I think that is pretty much it for the Chinese Liu rifle. Thank you for watching, guys. I really hope you enjoyed watching as much as I enjoyed taking this apart and showing you how it works. This is a marvelously good condition gun. It looks like the stock is brand new out of the factory. Really, really cool. There are very few of these around. Maybe a dozen, maybe 2 dozen were originally manufactured. They're basically unknown in China because only a handful of them ever went there for testing, and those are long since destroyed. The ones that survive here in the United States, like this one, are pretty much guns that were gifted to people by Pratt Whitney or by Liu while they were being made here, or guns that, for whatever reason, kind of fell off the back of the truck and never made it to China in the shipment with the tooling. So very scarce guns to find, very cool pieces of American and Chinese and semi-automatic rifle history. If you'd like to own this one yourself, take a look at the description text below. You'll find a link to Rock Island's catalog page for it, and you can see their description and their pictures, and you can place a bid over the phone or online or here in person at the auction. Thanks for watching.